You step outside for a moment, maybe to check the mail, maybe to take a phone call, maybe just to feel the evening air. You glance up at the sky, notice the color of it, and go back inside. The whole thing takes 30 seconds. But your ancestors didn't do that. They lived outside. Every hour of every day, they were inside the world the way you are inside a building. The sky wasn't something they glanced at. It was the ceiling of everything they knew. And that raises a question most people never think to ask. What did they actually see when they looked up? Not what we imagine they saw, not what appears in movies. What did this planet look like before we built walls between ourselves and it? The answer is stranger than most people are prepared for. For more than 300,000 years, human beings navigated this world with no maps, no instruments, and no artificial light. What they had instead was direct contact with a planet that was constantly broadcasting information, a world that never stopped talking, and they were listening. Start with the night sky, because that is where the gap between their world and yours is easiest to measure. On a clear night, far from any city, the human eye can see roughly 2,500 stars with the naked eye. That is what you might see today if you drove hours away from light pollution, waited for your eyes to fully adjust, and had perfectly clear weather overhead. Your ancestors had none of those conditions to worry about. There were no cities, no streetlights, no orange glow softening the dark. What they saw every single night of their lives was something most living humans have never witnessed. The Milky Way was not a faint smudge, it was a river of light, dense enough to divide the sky in half, bright enough under the right conditions to cast shadows on the ground, actual shadows from starlight alone. And if that sounds impossible, consider what happened in 1994. An earthquake knocked out power across Los Angeles. With the city suddenly dark, people began calling emergency services to report a strange silver cloud hanging over the city. The cloud was the Milky Way. Many of them had never seen it before. Think about that for a second. A natural feature that was visible to every human who had ever lived for hundreds of thousands of years had become so unfamiliar that people mistook it for a threat. That is not a small difference. That is the difference between living inside a world and viewing it through a window. But the sky was only one layer. In some ways, it was the easiest one. Ancient humans did not just observe nature, they were fluent in it. There is an important difference between observation and fluency. A tourist hears a language. A native speaker lives inside it. That is what the landscape was to our ancestors, not scenery, not background. A language they had been reading since before they could walk. Every shift in wind, every animal call, every change in cloud formation carried meaning. To them, the world was not silent, it was legible. Hunter-gatherer trackers can follow an animal across ground that appears empty to the rest of us. A bent blade of grass, a disturbance in dust thinner than a coat of paint. The reaction of insects to something that passed through minutes earlier. The ground becomes text, and they read it the way you are reading these words right now, quickly, automatically, without conscious effort. The same was true for navigation. Long before compasses, people crossed enormous distances by memorizing the land itself. In Australia, entire routes across the continent were encoded in songs. Each verse corresponded to a landmark, a water source, a change in terrain, or a seasonal pattern. The song and the landscape were the same thing. Imagine being able to travel through hundreds of miles of desert with nothing in your hands because the map exists in your memory and the memory is tied to the shape of the world around you. That is not folklore. That is a different relationship with reality. Picture a morning 70,000 years ago. The air is cold before dawn. A small group is waking near the edge of a forest where it opens onto grassland. The fire has burned down to warm coals. Someone is already watching the horizon, not out of curiosity, out of necessity. The color of the sky told your ancestors where moisture was gathering, whether rain was likely within hours, whether the wind would change direction before midday. The sky was a clock, a calendar, and a weather report all at once. And it was accurate because the people reading it had spent their entire lives under that exact sky. Modern weather apps give us information. Ancient humans had something else: continuity, generations of accumulated attention. The sounds alone would have changed how you experience the world. Before industrialization, the natural soundscape of Earth was so rich that many ecologists now describe modern silence as one of the least noticed environmental changes in human history. Birds occupied different acoustic niches. Insects filled specific frequencies. Frogs, mammals, wind through different kinds of vegetation. Each added another layer. To your ancestors, this was not background noise. It was a surveillance system. A sudden silence in the middle of the day meant something had entered the area that did not belong there. Experienced hunters could identify specific alarm calls and infer not just that a threat was present, but what kind of threat it was and which direction it was moving. The landscape was constantly updating them. Half a kilometer away, invisible behind trees, a bird might announce that a predator had crossed a boundary. Your ancestors heard that announcement, they understood it. And then there was smell. This is the hardest part to imagine because smell leaves almost no archaeological record, but your nose contains hundreds of distinct receptor types capable of detecting an astonishing range of chemical signals. In a world without engines, exhaust, detergents, perfumes, and synthetic chemicals, those receptors were not competing with a permanent cloud of artificial scent. Rain had a smell long before it arrived. Water had a smell. Certain plants released oils when disturbed by large animals. A fresh scent trail could reveal what had passed through an area even when the ground showed nothing at all. Your body can still do versions of this. It just almost never gets asked to. That world did not disappear overnight. It faded. Agriculture reduced mobility. Cities concentrated humans in environments that had little resemblance to the ones we evolved inside. Industry buried the soundscape beneath engine noise and replaced the night sky with a permanent ceiling of light. And screens arrived last, completing the substitution, giving the eyes and the attention something to do that had nothing to do with reading wind, tracking movement, or watching the horizon. We did not simply lose contact with nature, we traded it for comfort, for safety, for food security, for warmth, for the ability to survive without needing to read the sky. Those are extraordinary achievements. The point is not that we made the wrong trade. The point is that most of us never stopped to ask what was on the other side of it. Because here is where it becomes complicated. People often imagine that ancient life was peaceful and modern life is stressful. The evidence suggests something more interesting. Forager populations experienced intense immediate stress, injury, predators, conflict, scarcity. But those stress responses were usually tied to real events. A threat appeared, the body activated, the threat passed, the body recovered. Modern life produces a different pattern, a low continuous activation, notifications, deadlines, messages, financial pressure, social evaluation. Your nervous system turns on, but it rarely receives a clear signal that the danger has ended. And underneath all of this sits one uncomfortable fact. Your brain is still running ancient hardware. The visual system that evolved to detect movement at the edge of a grassland now reacts to a notification sliding onto a screen. The threat detection circuitry that once monitored weather, animals, and rival humans now processes email subject lines, unread messages, and the tone of a text. The machinery is old, only the inputs have changed. This helps explain one of the most consistent findings in environmental psychology. Natural environments restore attention, not because forests are magically calming, but because your perceptual system evolved inside environments like them. In a city, your attention is constantly being captured. Advertisements, traffic, alerts, signs, movement, noise. In a genuinely wild environment, attention shifts into a different mode, broader, less forced, less defensive. Researchers have found measurable improvements in directed attention, working memory, and stress markers after surprisingly short periods of exposure to natural settings. The important word is not beautiful, it is familiar. Not familiar to your conscious mind, familiar to the nervous system that has been shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. And that points to something even deeper than stress reduction. What changes may not be just how you feel, it may be how you think. In studies where participants spent several days in wilderness settings without access to technology, Performance on creative problem-solving tasks improved dramatically. The explanation was not mystical, it was mechanical. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for focused analytical control, gets tired. In a technology-saturated environment, it is almost never allowed to fully rest. But remove the constant inputs, and something interesting happens. Thought becomes less linear, more associative, more like the kind of thinking required to track an animal, read weather, or make decisions with incomplete information. That capacity is still in you. It has just been waiting for conditions that no longer exist by default. Your ancestors looked up at a sky bright enough to cast shadows from starlight. They heard a world so dense with information that losing it took centuries of noise to accomplish. They read the ground the way you read text. They felt the wind change and knew, often before conscious thought, what that change meant. Not as a skill they practiced occasionally, as a language they had grown up inside. A language the entire surface of the earth was speaking all the time. You stepped outside for 30 seconds today. You noticed the color of the sky, maybe the temperature, maybe a sound that barely registered before you were already back inside. And somewhere beneath the part of you that lives in rooms and reads screens and measures time in calendar blocks, there is an older part, a part that is still 300,000 years old, a part that has never seen a ceiling. And when you stepped outside, even for those 30 seconds, it was paying attention. It still is.